Granted, every day of their lives, they get their phone out, they get their computer out, and they just get on it. But they forget the people that don't have that ability. We rely on a telephone and human communication. That has disappeared. The worst of all are the banks. If you get through to the robot, it says to you, please use the internet. And I'm shouting at the telephone saying, don't you think I would do if I could see? If I had access in my home to the software and the computer that I need for my visual impairment, I would still need somebody to come to my home to teach me how to use it. This has not existed at all since the pandemic. And we mustn't be forgotten because we are maybe an older generation or a disabled generation. We are the forgotten people in this pandemic. We have been sidelined.
Penny Jordan there on being left out of the internet, which we've been talking about to some extent. And the first example, Michelle Barber in Folkestone, whose eyes really opened to deprivation within her own backyard. Let's focus then on things we've learned about those who have struggled most, about the challenges that we've become more aware of in the pandemic. And Louise Casey, let's just start with isolation and loneliness and sometimes despair. All the systems of the good work that we've been talking about that may cover, on a good day, 80% of those who need support, they're always going to leave some people out. And I don't know what you do or what lessons we have learned about how you pick up those people who are not covered elsewhere.
First of all, I think the pandemic has essentially created just a significantly greater number of people who are struggling. So before the pandemic, for example, we had the rise of something called the working poor, where essentially in the last decade or so, it's been much more difficult to work your way out of poverty. So no matter how many jobs you take on, because of how they're paid, actually you can't find your way through it. The pandemic has just, I think, my own view is it's ripped apart the issues around poverty in the country, and the divide between the haves and the have-nots now feels just huge. And I could bore you with evidence and statistics with that, but let's just take that. And I think that within that group, of course, what it has done is just laid bare the frailty of our system, really. So, for example, as Penny was saying, the whole of society now works on the internet. It works around IT. It's a massive gap in our society about how we respond to that. It's a bit like social care. Our social care system was built in a post-war Britain where essentially the average life expectancy was, I think, 66. After the Second World War, it's now 86. So we've got sort of 20th century structures within our government, our local government and our communities. And that then means that essentially for the super group of people who are vulnerable, their life has taken an even bigger tumble. So I think to just say it's a small minority wouldn't be true, in my opinion, Evan. I think that we have to go back and make sure we pull everybody through this pandemic, rich, poor, wherever they are in the country, and that we need to be thoughtful and deliberative about how we do that. And then I think that in terms of where we are in the 21st century, some of the big issues that we need to look at are things like the digital divide. And, look at what happened in education, that kids on free school meals did particularly badly. For all the efforts of organisations like the Wimbledon Football Club, we all know that actually we neither had a learn at home strategy from the government, nor did we have a learn in the classroom strategy. And Rachel's right, noble efforts have been made to do something about that, and some of it was highly effective. But what the pandemic has done is thrown the spotlight on the things that we already knew were challenging, were bad, and it gives us a massive opportunity to do something about that. The pandemic gives this government, gives everybody across the political divide the ability to say, look, nobody thought the pandemic was going to come down the track like this. It's had extraordinary effects across our communities, and we all need to come together to do something about it for everyone and to bring the whole country together as we move through it and out the other side. And Evan, that will take years. That's not months and that's not weeks. Getting that right will take time.
I hear you that it takes years. I mean, on the one hand, you might say we need a big commission to look at all of these big social problems and to deliberate and to think about it. On the other hand, I'm thinking here, Penny Jordan's issue is we need a phone line which she can call and which can do the searching on the internet for her, or someone going in and giving her the equipment and teaching her how to use the equipment that's designed specially for people with limited sight. I mean, I don't know, do we need big thinking here, or do we need little thinking? I mean, I'm sort of torn.
We need both thinking, I think, Evan. That's what we need. I mean, you're absolutely right. And actually, we now have a legion of volunteers in every street in the community. And if the RNIB wanted to set up a scheme, they'd have a legion of people happy to help. Of course, there are small things that we can do all the time. And that isn't small, incidentally. That's massive to that woman, and therefore it counts. But I think we also need to come at overall, look at the digital divide in terms of children and their learning, and the fact that the pandemic has set back the country in terms of its children by quite a significant mile, and therefore government needs to step into that space and is to try and do something about it.
And I think coming into that, Evan, if I may, it's great we're talking about the opportunities and the things that have emerged from the pandemic, but the pandemic was a utterly dreadful event, continues to be, that we wouldn't wish upon anyone. And while we have been able to carry on lives to a degree that would have been completely unimaginable even 30 years ago because of the internet, I think the pandemic has also exposed the limits of this digital life. And that is certainly true for children. It's true when I look at my children, but it's even more true when you look at children for deprivation. You cannot replicate the physical interaction, the socialization, the emotional support, as well as the educational quality of children being together in a school through the internet. And I think one of the things that we have to recognize as we think about what we might do next is there are lots of things we don't know how to do if we're just trying to do them online. There are a lot of things we don't know how to do right now. We don't know how to catch up all of these children at 4 times the rate that they'd normally have been learning, when many of them have been stuck indoors in God knows what situation for a year. So I think we need to, be impressed by the efforts of the pandemic, recognize the limitations of what was possible, and also have some humility about what it is we know how to do next.
Toby Lloyd.
I would just say I completely agree with what Louise is saying, that it's not about the big state or kind of small bottom-up community action either or. It's very much both. And actually, we know that where both are properly aligned, that's where we've had the most success in response to the pandemic. So, there's been some great research showing that places where the local authority has really nurtured a kind of community level of infrastructure and community action before the pandemic have coped much, much better when the crisis hit, because there were already those networks, those organisations that really knew exactly who the most vulnerable people were, because they have that really kind of close to the community, close to the people presence. And I actually think that therefore a lot of the stuff we have come together around over the pandemic will last, because those WhatsApp groups, those community organisations will find new purposes after the pandemic. And actually we'll see that next time there's a crisis, the places that kind of came together and created lasting institutions and lasting networks during this crisis will be better placed to deal with whatever that crisis is next time it hits us.
Have you got examples, Toby?
Absolutely. I mean, the Nuffield Foundation did an amazing study looking at places, the whole range of different local authorities around the country found that places like Blackburn and Darwin, Calderdale, Walsall, Waltham Forest, where the council had really invested, not huge amounts by kind of public standards, but significant amounts in bolstering local community groups. So not just the council doing things for their local people, but enabling local organisations to form themselves and define what they wanted to happen in their neighbourhoods. That those places actually got twice the level of public involvement in social activism to respond to the crisis when it hit, because they already had the networks, they already had the places and the organisations there to mobilise people.
Very interesting. So the enabling local government as a kind of catalyst for lots of stuff to happen,
Absolutely.
But not necessarily trying to do it all. John?
Yes, what we have in the South Wales valleys and in other post-industrial areas is what has been experienced by the rest of the UK during the pandemic. So for us, very little has changed. I have a church of over 100 members that come every Sunday to the service. I know of one family that had the luxury to work from home. Many are unemployed. There's many children in my kids' schools that are 4th generation unemployed. Most of those who are working are in low-income jobs. They work for the NHS or in care work. I think what the pandemic has done is it's woken the nation to the reality of a need that has existed for generation after generation in post-industrial areas.
But tell us, John, from your experience, what can local government do? What can anybody do to say, take a community that has its challenges and create a platform for people to volunteer, for people to find out those in need, just for stuff to happen?
Well, I'm very blessed in Torvine in that we've got a wonderful MP, Nick Thomas Simmons, who's currently the Shadow Home Secretary. He was out delivering food parcels for the church and for the community during the height of the pandemic. We've got some wonderful councillors and, like myself, they're engaged with the community and we work together. We partner with leading charities, local businesses, and it's about engaging and meeting a need.
What about you, Toby?
I would say that the secret sauce here, Evan, is actually that kind of secondary tier of agencies that can really nurture a kind of dynamic local community sector. So, often that can be the local authority itself, but it can be the church, but it can also be organisations like Big Local, which has spent the last 10 years going around working with the most deprived communities in the country and saying, here's just £1 million to do whatever you think is necessary. And we can now see the benefits of that because just that kind of bit of seed funding has enabled those communities to kind of come together, work out what they need in the local area, whether it's just, some better park benches, some play equipment, cleaning up litter problems, whatever it is. When the pandemic hits, those places are then just in a better place to respond quickly and well. Or it's anchor institutions like community businesses that provide a kind of a physical and a social presence for people to come, for communities to meet together, to coalesce around their local place and their local problems.
I think you want to come in, Louise.
Look, I completely understand where both Toby and John you're coming from. And I've volunteered myself in a community centre at the moment on food. And I think all of that needs to happen. But I think that what we're facing, we've doubled the number of people on universal credit. Remember that when people go onto universal credit, the majority of them go immediately into debt because of the 5-week delay in our system about how we pay people, that the number of people that are in debt is in the millions because of the pandemic, and we know the connection between debt and depression. It's like two sides of the same coin. We know the issues of loneliness where actually grassroots organisations, and particularly the church, I absolutely, not just the church, but all religious organisations have been so active during the pandemic, and I hope that that continues. But there are sort of systemic big things that we've got to look at, and part of me worries that, like the Times told me, that their Christmas campaign this year with Fair Share and a sports organisation and another organisation, it raised more money this year than all their preceding campaigns. And, we've got the wonderful Captain Tom that raised hundreds of thousands of pounds for NHS charities. And I sort of think there is an issue here, sorry to be so boring and old-fashioned about taxation and about the government, and actually saying, anybody that can help, can they also help by paying more taxes? And can we have a government that thinks, I don't want to have intergenerational unemployment as a legacy of this pandemic, and I don't want to have food banks as a legacy of this pandemic, that we should work out why people are hungry and why they are not able to sustain themselves, and why do we have hungry children? And some of the answers, we know the answers right now, but I don't want the government to think this is just another sort of big society, everybody just be nicer to each other and it'll all be okay. My own WhatsApp group in my own street is not going to look after the elderly people here, and is not going to look after the homeless household that lives next door to me who has nothing.
Rachel.
I think that there are two different things here, but both are incredibly important, because what I heard from John and Toby was about the fundamental importance of long-term permanent institutions that are not just the national government or even just the local government, that understand the needs of the place, that can respond to the needs of the place and the community, and are in a better position to make those decisions rapidly. And I think there's a lot the government can do as it starts to think about its levelling up agenda to support those institutions, whether it's civic universities or charities or other kinds of local actors. And that's not about how much funding is coming, that's about who is going to do the best with that funding and serve people best. And that seems to me utterly crucial. The other thing, and we may want to talk about this more, but obviously when we go and do a lot of our kind of public opinion research and sort of focus groups around the country, which we spend a lot of time doing, there are enormous tensions coming up for the government because what they have done in the last year with the pandemic is spend unprecedented amounts of government funding to try and keep things afloat. And they are facing higher unemployment and far more demands on basic services, from catching up on backlogs in health to sorting out social care to doing catch up in education, while having lots of people who feel their own personal circumstances are more constrained. And these are not easy tensions to resolve.
No one says it's easy, but
No,
they are resolvable, aren't they? The government can put up taxes and spend more money on the social problems that many people have had their eyes opened to.
The government can put up taxes, have already put up taxes. I think people fully expect that they may have to put up taxes again, but it will require choices. You know, how much of that is going to go through solving NHS backlogs? How much of that is going to go towards tutoring children to try and catch them up? How much of it is going to go on keeping universal credit up for people who are unemployed? How much of it is going to go on stimuluses to try and persuade companies to increase employment and get things back on track? I don't want to pretend that this is not possible for the government to resolve. I just also don't want to pretend that it's simple.
John, can I just get your opinion on this? Because I'd be interested in whether you think it's just about the money and the government is going to have to step up to the plate for real social change to occur.
In the Welsh valleys, we've had 3-4 generations of poverty where governments have come in and tried to resolve the issues in many different ways. But what's the fruit of this? The church, however, promotes a personal responsibility to care for your neighbour. And through the pandemic, people, whether they're, as you say, religious or not, are willing to help and do their bit. And yes, the government need to be accountable for how they serve us, but we have personal responsibility too. You know, I get concerned when we try and pass the buck entirely to the government when we're not willing to do our little bit ourselves.
I want to just move on if we could. And Toby, this is where I'm looking at you, because it's actually about the built environment and the way that shapes all of what we're talking about. And we've all learned the values of parks, let's be honest, taking walks. Why don't you just talk us through what we've learned?
Well, we've learned lots of things that we kind of already knew, or at least we knew on a kind of academic level, or kind of campaigners or organisations like Create Streets have been banging on for years. But suddenly we now all know it in a much more kind of real, personal, kind of visceral sense. So we know things now like quiet streets that aren't full of rat-running cars are much nicer for community interaction, right? Fairly obvious. We've known that for forever. But it goes right to the heart of this, that streets that are pleasant and approachable, people know their neighbours more. And then the kids get more exercise and people are healthier and the air quality is better. So we know this now, and we kind of always knew it, but now we really get it. So there's been a massive increase in improvements to local street environments, opening up streets to walking, cycling and other forms of active transport, and reducing the amount of cars, which have been a bit controversial in some places, but overwhelmingly have been successful. There's been a phenomenal improvement in that kind of local environment as a result. But it's also things about the nature of the places that we create in terms of the houses themselves. So Create Streets did a report entitled Terraced Friendship, because it's just showing that during the first lockdown, we could see that the people who got on and interacted with the neighbours most were those who lived in traditional terraced housing, just because the nature of those buildings, chats over the garden fence, were places that fostered a kind of neighbourly community response much better than, say, high-rise towers or kind of converted buildings.
I think these are really important things that we might take away from the pandemic. I want to finish with just getting you each to nominate a small policy change which, out of this crisis, you think government should adopt that would improve life at a community, neighbourly level, or improve the welfare of families. I'll just suggest one, by the way, which is making it more possible for people in flats to get pets. I think one thing we haven't talked about is the role of pets in people's lives and helping them maintain good, healthy mental states. So that is my one. But I'd like to go through you all a very narrow, specific thing that would improve life. Rachel Wolfe.
I would be investing in the physical place that Toby was talking about, and particularly from the kind of focus groups that I do, that has to be about centres. And so I would be funding places things to do, high streets, as a way of bringing people back together after the pandemic.
Very interesting. Toby, come on then.
I'll build on what Rachel was saying. I would absolutely turbocharge the community ownership fund that the government has set up. There's going to be a huge number, for example, of empty shops on high streets that are going to sit there blighting communities for decades to come unless we do something about it. But they're also a massive opportunity for communities to actually take ownership of those assets. The government's dipped its toe in this water, but it really just needs, we know what works, we know what support those communities need to take ownership of buildings like that and put them to really good local use. So we just need to turbocharge that now. So I'll take it from the £150 million they've allocated so far to, 10 times that.
Louise.
I would give every single family on free school meals or some way of finding poor households a freezer, because we know that both food waste, but most importantly, the money is transformed by 35% if a family has a freezer that they can use. So it reduces waste and it reduces cost. It's a really simple thing we could just crack on with.
That is a really interesting. I've never ever heard that suggestion, and it's a really interesting one. Why don't you finish, John?
Yeah, I think what the pandemic has taught us is that when people have time on their hands, they like to do good. And if there is some way that the government can support people to make time to help their local communities, that would be wonderful. Perhaps half a day off a week of work that is government supported, that would allow people to engage with something in their local community.
Lots of great suggestions. Thank you all for those. Let me thank my guests for their contributions through the programmes. Reverend John Edward Fannell, pastor of Northford Church in Abersucken near Pontypool. Rachel Wolfe from the think tank Public